Good day, everyone. My name is David Williams, Executive Director of the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Misallocation of Renewable Energy Sources. We are grateful to Dr. Mario Samano from HSA Montreal for today's timely discussion. We're also grateful to the Canadian Association for Energy Economics for co-hosting this webinar with IAEE. First, a little bit about IAEE. We are the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations, along with a host of other products and services that you can find at our website at www.iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our presenter. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for our panelists, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window and type your question. We've allocated sufficient time at the end of the webinar to address your questions. And now I would like to introduce you to our presenter, Dr. Mario Samano, Associate Professor at HSA Montreal. Mario, over to you.
Thank you, David. Thanks for the nice introduction. Let me share the screen. All right, so thank you to David for that presentation and for both associations for the invitation to present today. So today I'm going to present this project that we call Misallocation of Renewable Energy Sources, which is a joint work with Stefan Lamb, who works at the Toulouse School of Economics, and myself here in Montreal at HSC Montreal. All right, so some brief introduction and background to what we want to do. So renewable energy sources, which I want to be referring to as RES throughout the presentation, in electricity markets come with a number of benefits, but also with large economic impacts. Among them, as we all know, these are costly technologies that even when computed as levelized costs, they are not always the best technology in some regions. We know that the output of these sources is not correlated or not perfectly correlated with demand, depending on whether we talk about solar power or wind power. They also have an issue known as intermittency, which means that there is an unforecastable component that in some locations and at some times of the day can be an important factor that diminishes its value. We know that the technologies to store the output of the sources is still quite expensive. And in general, these sources are non-dispatchable, which makes them, which puts them in a disadvantage relative to traditional sources. All this combined with the presence of policies that incentivize the adoption of renewable energy sources made us think about the nature of these incentives, which in most cases consist of uniform incentives, meaning the same level of incentive regardless of the region within country or regardless of the technology. And we want to measure whether those policies properly account for the costs and benefits of these new technologies. Specifically in this paper, we're going to be talking about some policies that go in general by the name feed-in-tariffs or FITs. They consist of a preferential rate paid to producers of electricity that use renewable energy sources. These are policies regulated by the government, and they specify long-term contracts of about 15 to 20 years. These policies have been put in place in a number of countries and jurisdictions. Just to give you a few examples, these policies have been put in place in the UK, in Australia, and in Ontario here in Canada. And today, our case study is going to be using data from Germany. So these are very popular policies to incentivize renewable energy sources. The main questions in our paper, in our project, are these uniform levels of feed-in tariffs comparable to the distribution of marginal benefits across regions, right? This is an empirical question that may have a different answer on different markets. And if the answer is no, that means that there was room for improvement in the design of the feed-in tariffs. The second question is whether, given the current allocation of solar, that may have been in part motivated by the incentives put in place, whether this allocation of plants is optimal. So we're going to do an ex post analysis of the allocation of solar PV plants in Germany and discuss whether there was perhaps a better way to allocate those sources. A few more details. In this paper, we're going to use an extensive and high frequency data set on electricity production and demand. We're going to use those data to measure the benefits that come from an additional unit of production that comes from renewable energy sources. And the key driver of this additional benefits is the displacement at the margin of production from conventional sources in order to still satisfy demand. Then we're going to compute counterfactual scenarios in which this renewable energy source capacity gets reallocated in a different way to maximize its benefits while keeping the total amount of capacity constant in the market. That is, we're going to take the total solar capacity in the market and we're going to redistribute it in a way that we believe could maximize its benefits. Then we're going to compare those benefits against the benefits that we obtain from the current allocation and discuss whether there would have been ways to obtain a better distribution of these installations. And third, we're going to repeat this reallocation exercise by discussing a current policy debate in Germany that consists of extending the transmission capacity between two regions in that market. We're going to have to compute some shadow cost of transmission and use it to back out implied size of transmission capacity. We believe that our contribution consists of providing a comprehensive framework to analyze uniform feed-in tariff policies. This is going to extend the literature in a number of ways. It's going to extend the literature that focuses on emission displacement, but without taking into account the interactions with these type of policies. We're going to quantify empirically the effects of renewable energy sources expansions on ancillary services costs, which, as you will see, they are small, but we believe that it's important to put a number on these effects. And we're going to be using actual output data from solar panels as opposed to simulated data. As I said before, today we're going to be using data from Germany. Why Germany? It's historically important. It was the first country to implement this type of policies since 2000. The feed-in tariffs are uniform for type of RES technology, and they don't take into account differences in sunshine radiation or differences in electricity demand. And we're going to be focusing on solar as the main distributed renewable energy source with this type of policy. So this is a key graph that motivates our paper. We have 3 panels. This is the map of Germany and the different municipalities. And the first panel shows the global solar radiation. That is, which regions get more radiation per square meter. Darker colors represent higher levels. And as you can see, the trend is very clear. The southern part of Germany receives more radiation than other parts of the country. When we move on to panel B, this is the installed solar capacity, the cumulative solar capacity installed. And again, darker regions represent higher levels. And the concentration of installed capacity is not in the south of Germany. This shows a negative correlation of installed capacity and radiation, which says something about the potential inefficiency of the allocation of this capacity. You may think that this can be related to demand needs. And on the third panel, we plot the electricity demand by state in Germany, darker regions with higher demand levels. And there is no visual correlation with either panel A or panel B. And all these three elements led us to think that there is a space, or there was a space for improvement over the distribution of the solar capacity installed. All right, so let me dive into some of the data and how we measure the marginal benefits. So very quickly, so the data we'll be using comes from the 4 transmission system operators in Germany, which are the main divisions of the German market. I'm going to be referring to these entities as TSOs. We're going to have data for 2 years, 2015 and 2016, at a frequency of 15 minutes. So we're going to be using load and supply from both conventional and non-conventional sources for each TSO. This comes from the NCOE. We're going to be using cost of ancillary services for each TSO, and daily production cost by technology, coal prices, natural gas prices, fuel, oil, from different sources to compute marginal costs. As microdata, we're going to be using administrative data on the installations and capacity of solar plants. We're going to be using approximately 300 stations, real data from PV Output, which is a company that keeps track of production of solar panels, and data on power plant outages and unavailability of plants when we split one of the regions in Germany to try to increase transmission capacity. So this is a map of Germany, and the 4 TSOs that we're going to be talking about. Their names are 50 Hertz, Emprion, Tenet, and Transnet PW. I'll be referring to these names in some of the slides. So one of the main drivers of the benefits of expanding the capacity of renewable energy sources is the displacement of conventional sources. So by each unit of displacement, we're going to be saving money on the operation costs and reducing emissions. So what we do is that at each 15-minute interval, we sort the technologies by marginal cost to simulate dispatching. The underlying assumption is that the load is dispatched by minimizing production costs. This is a paper about allocation, and therefore market power issues can be left aside. And we retain the identity of the marginal technology for each period. And this table shows the frequencies of the marginal sources. And we see that it's a typical market, if you want to call it that way, in which natural gas is the most frequently marginal source. They are the peakers. And then we have other technologies such as hard coal, nuclear, oil, and renewables at the end. This is all pooled for TSOs. Now, if we disaggregate this by TSO, we obtain these histograms, and we see differences in their composition. This is because the portfolio mix of the technologies that each TSO owns to produce electricity is different. For example, Transnet BW on the right bottom panel has a lower mean than the other 3 TSOs. This is because of its large component of nuclear energy, which lowers its marginal cost. So this lambdas, we're going to be calling them lambdas, this marginal cost, are going to be used as one of the components of the marginal benefits. We're going to follow the literature. We're going to follow what Calloway, Foley, McCormick, and Tom Tangueras and Frank Wallach have have done before. And we're going to separate the marginal benefits from one additional unit of production of electricity as the sum of the value of the displaced emissions plus the value of the avoided operating costs. Those are going to be the lambdas from the previous slide, and the ancillary service costs. So let me talk about each one of those elements separately. So the displaced emissions are the avoided emissions from the marginal fossil fuel source displaced by the renewables output. The avoided operating costs are the savings from the last unit of electricity produced by the dispatchable unit. And the ancillary service costs are the costs associated with maintaining system stability. We want to compare the distribution of these marginal benefits against the uniform feed-in tariff incentives. So more in detail, we want to make evident, as the two papers I've mentioned before have done, the relationship between the correlation of solar output and production cost, and how that affects the avoided operating costs. So we, at the top of this slide, we have this expression that makes this clear and quantifies the operating costs as the mean marginal cost in one region plus a term that is proportional to the correlation of solar output, is this omegas, and the marginal cost. So this makes evident that if the plants were located in regions with high correlation with marginal costs, the value of the new technologies will be higher. Similarly, the same arithmetic applies when you talk about emissions. You replace the lambdas by the emission rate E, and the value of displaced emissions is going to be, again, the sum of the mean emissions in region J plus a term that is directly connected to the correlation between the solar output and the emissions. So this makes evident that the location of the plants is highly important to maximize the benefits. Ancillary service costs need to be treated in a different way. And what we do in this paper is to propose a new method to evaluate these avoided costs. So we're going to be projecting the ancillary service costs AS on a polynomial of degree 3 on renewables, that's the R, and Q, which is the total demand at time t. The marginal effect is going to be the derivative of this function with respect to R. So we do that by using a machine learning method to separate different patterns of load across the 4 TSOs. Specifically, we use a method called k-means clustering for each TSO separately. And this is the visual representation of the load profiles across the 4 TSOs. Then for each of those different load profiles, we're going to estimate the regression from the previous slide, and that's going to give us marginal effects of expansions in solar production on ancillary services for each TSO. Putting all this together, we obtain this table where each row represents one of the 4 regions in Germany, and each of the 4 columns is the component of the marginal benefits. We see that the ancillary costs, as I mentioned in the beginning, are much smaller than the other 2 components. This is something that has not been fully documented in the literature, and we think that this is an empirical contribution. The avoided operating costs and avoided emissions represent most of the costs, and when we add them together, we see that the differences seem small across the 4 TSOs, but they come with large volatility if we look at the standard deviations, which are in parentheses. One thing also to mention here is that this value of the avoided emissions was calculated using a value of ton of CO2 emissions of 31 euros per ton, which is in some scenarios a conservative measure of the damage of emissions. Had we used a higher value for the emissions, this third column will have obviously higher numbers, and that will cause higher variation in the marginal benefits of the TSO's benefits. So we believe that we're giving here a conservative scenario, and yet we observe variation in the marginal benefits. This puts in perspective the uniform nature of the feed-in tariffs and suggests that perhaps each region should have had a different level of the incentive in order to allocate solar capacity more efficiently. So let me talk now about misallocation. This is a paper about scarcity and inefficiency, and we're going to be looking at a way to reconstruct the configuration of solar capacity in Germany and see if there were gains left on the table because of the original design of the feed-in tariff policy. So to measure misallocation, the key observation is that productive inefficiencies occur because more capacity has been allocated to areas with lower solar productivity. We want to compute this a counterfactual in which the actual output is going to be compared, the value of the actual output is going to be compared to the value of simulated output. We're going to allocate maximum capacity to areas with higher solar productivity, and then the remaining capacity to areas in decreasing order of solar productivity. Then we're going to take the ratio of actual and benchmark total benefits, and that's going to give us our measure of misallocation. So how do we do this more specifically? Each 15 minutes, for each 15-minute interval, we have the marginal benefits we computed in the previous section. And we're going to multiply that by the solar output in the current allocation. That's going to give us the value of the current allocation, the benchmark. In our counterfactual, we're going to rank the TSOs by mean productivity, and we're going to choose a value of solar penetration that we're going to call gamma. This is going to be the proportion, the fraction of capacity in the TSO that is going to be allowed to be solar capacity. So you can think of this as to be similar to a renewable portfolio standard, but instead of being a minimum, this is a maximum. This is going to be the maximum fraction that a TSO is allowed to have coming from solar capacity. So call capital S the total amount of currently installed residential solar capacity in all Germany, and we're going to reallocate it as follows. This is very simple. We're going to add gamma, our policy parameter, times the total capacity in the TSO with the highest average productivity to this TSO, right? So we're going to concentrate all the solar capacity that exists in Germany. We're not going to add any additional capacity. We're going to take the existing capacity, multiply it by this factor gamma, and assign it to the region with the highest average productivity. Notice that we are not going to assign it to the highest marginal benefit region, but rather the one with the highest potential of production of solar output. Then whatever is remaining, whatever remains from the total capacity is going to be assigned to the second highest productivity TSO up to that fraction gamma. If there is something left, that's going to be assigned to the third highest productivity TSO. And if S has not yet been depleted, that's going to continue onto the fourth TSO. This is our reallocation method. And then we're going to use individual PV plants output data in our marginal benefits estimates to come up with a new value of this redistribution of solar panels. Our microdata consist of actual locations of solar PV panels that are represented in this map as blue dots. And those are the ones that we're going to use to simulate our counterfactual allocation. We're going to be concentrating on PV plants less than 10 kilowatts of capacity, because those could be the ones more affected by changes in feed-in tariff policy. This is our main results. So we're interested in what we call the reallocation value, which is simply the ratio of the value in our counterfactual reallocation divided by the value of the current distribution of solar capacity. And then we take, we express this as percentages, and we plot them in this in these two panels. The panel on the left uses this conservative value for the value of the damage of emissions, and we see that if our policy parameter was 20%, so gamma equals 0.2, that's related to approximately 4.75% gains from reallocation. This says if we had placed the solar capacity in a slightly different way by putting more in places where there is more potential for production, for higher productivity of the solar panels, we would have increased this, the output by 5%. Now, if the policymaker had in mind a higher value for the social cost of carbon, SCC stands for social cost of carbon, let's say 50 euros per ton, which is a number that some analysts use, then these gains will be much higher, right? At 20% of penetration rates, we will have about 7 to 8% gains. Now observe that when I increase the value of the social cost of carbon, now I have negative gains. This is because in the reallocation, this is going to go at first potentially to places where even though they have higher productivity potential, the sources that have been displaced in the beginning have lower costs and lower emissions. As the rate of penetration increases, the substitution is strong enough that the gains become positive. So let me decompose the previous graph into the three elements that we're using to measure benefits. This graph plots the changes in each component relative to their baseline. So what we have on the horizontal axis again is the proportion of total capacity that can be from solar. This is our policy parameter gamma. And then on the vertical axis, we have the percentage change relative to the baseline. We see that the solid blue line, the value of emissions displaced, increases, and then it plateaus. The increase is, of course, because as solar production increases, there is more displacement of emissions. And the plateau region, it's because if gamma is high enough, the highest productivity region is the one that obtains all the new solar capacity, and the benefits become constant at that point. Production costs decrease, but they plateau also at the end, and ancillary service costs follow a cubic function that comes from our assumed cubic polynomial for the estimation. Once again, notice that the value of emissions displaced has negative values for low values of gamma. This is again because the displacement might be occurring in regions where they have low emissions levels, but they happen to have high productivity potential. Now, to put all this in perspective, the percentage of gains, their actual contribution to the total gains in our reallocation are as follows. So the two main components, as I said before, in terms of size, are the value of emissions displaced and the production cost. Those are the two lines here at the top. And empirically, we can put these numbers on the ancillary service costs. And yes, they do have a small impact on this total gains, but we believed that there was a need for documenting this in a more systematic way. So now let me move on to a topic that is being controversial in Germany during the last couple of years. And this is extending the transmission capacity between the south and the north of Germany. So we're gonna look at this policy through the lens of our paper and see the value of transmission, of extensions in transmission, when you couple this with the presence of a reallocation, and see how much value you could increase in your reallocation if you allow for trade. So we're going to split TenneT, which is one of the 4 TSOs in Germany, into north and south region. Our south region is going to coincide with the boundaries of Bavaria in the south, right? And if you remember the map of Germany that I showed in the beginning, the south of Germany has a high potential for solar production, more than other regions in Germany. So how we're going to do this, we're going to map the location of each power plant in TenneT, both conventional and renewable energy sources. We're going to combine realized production data for renewable energy sources with data on plant unavailability and capacity factors of conventional power plants to construct simulated supply curves in the north and in the south. We're going to split, as I said before, the north and the south, the split TenneT into north and south based on population. So the south is going to be defined as Bavaria, which is about 41% of the total population of TenneT. And in terms of GDP, the south is going to account for 47% of the GDP relative to TenneT. Then we're going to obtain marginal cost that we're going to call LambdaN, LambdaS for each north and south as the intersections of supply and demand. This is a map that represents the different technologies and power plants locations in Germany. And so this is the type of data that we're going to use to split TenneT to obtain the supply curves in the north region of TenneT and then in the south region. Right, we need the supply curves because we want to measure displacement of emissions and costs. Therefore, we need to know which are the marginal technologies in each region at each point in time. So I'll go quickly on these technical details. So we need a mechanism that maps transmission capacity into marginal sources. So we're going to run these regressions that have the marginal cost in each region on net load, renewables minus load, and the quantity traded between the two regions. So the idea here is that these are going to be supply functions for transmission, and we're going to estimate these equations only for time intervals in which LambdaN is different than LambdaS. This means that there was an imbalance or that there was lack of transmission capacity, which caused the two marginal costs in the two regions to be different. So we do that for different price gaps. And we observe that across the pairs of columns 1, 2 versus 3 and 4 versus 5 and 6, the coefficients are relatively similar. We're going to be using the first two columns as our benchmark scenario. And from there, we're going to obtain an expression for the capacity imbalance. The details are in the paper, but we obtain a very simple expression that maps the coefficients that we obtain from our regression, the marginal cost that we're simulating for after the split of the two regions, into implied transmission capacity imbalances, right? Each of those numbers are these blue dots, and we take the mean of this, which gives us approximately 3.8 megawatts of capacity, which is comparable to the current lines being constructed in Germany. It's about twice the size, the line that is being currently built into Sweden, and it's about 3 times the size that was built between Tenet and one of the other 4 TSOs. So we're going to be using that number as our benchmark. And in this graph, we present what are the gains from expanding transmission capacity in the same way that we did in the second part of the paper. That is, take all the solar capacity that exists in the market and distribute it to now the 5 TSOs. We have 1 additional TSO, and compute the gains that you obtain from each of those allocations. In this experiment, we are reallocating all solar capacity, not just the residential solar installations. And each line here in this graph corresponds to different levels of transmission capacity built. When transmission capacity is equal to 0, the gains at first increase. This is just a consequence of reallocating solar panels, like in the first part of the paper. But then, because of the lack of transmission capacity, even if there is more solar output in the south, that could not be sent to the north, and that causes a decrease in gains. As you increase capacity, these numbers here on the right, you see that the gains from increasing the policy parameter gamma and increasing the capacity become larger and larger. Finally, we put all this together into a benefit cost analysis that speaks to the current debate in Germany about expansion. So here we, let's concentrate on columns 1 through 3. So if there is a transmission line of 2 gigawatts of capacity, let's see whether it's beneficial to build a project for each of these 3 different levels of gamma. 0.37, 37% is roughly the amount of renewables in Germany, 0.5 and 0.66. The annual gains from reallocation come from our reallocation counterfactual. These are in millions of euros. The annualized investment costs were obtained from industry documents. So we assume a 40-year lifespan with discount at 1% discount rate. And we have 2 different ways to connect the 2 regions. Overhead lines, which have a much, much lower cost than underground lines by a factor of 15. And then we compute the benefit cost ratio. And as you can see, only the overhead lines become beneficial, but only at high levels of gamma. And the underground lines become beneficial, that is a benefit cost ratio greater than 1 for a relatively high value of gamma of 0.66. Then we repeat this with a higher expansion in transmission capacity, 3 times larger. Therefore, the costs of installation grow. The annual gains from reallocation also grow. And yet, the benefit cost ratios qualitatively tell us the same story than with a smaller transmission capacity, which is overhead lines are beneficial more times than the underground lines, and underground lines become beneficial only if the parameter of reallocation is relatively high. So to conclude, we develop a comprehensive framework to measure misallocation of RES, which is inspired by the lack of flexibility in the feed-in-tariffs policies. This is a framework that could be used in other jurisdictions because we have made a point of using publicly available data. Our framework has 3 steps. First, we measure the marginal benefits from an additional unit of solar output. 2, we use those valuations to measure the potential gains under an efficient allocation of solar. And 3, we account for further gains if we had transmission capacities being expanded, as is in the case of Germany. Our results tell us that relatively low penetration rates of 20% for reallocation would have bring us 5% gains in value relative to the current allocation. Our paper is not about the design of the optimal feed-in tariff policy, but rather an ex-post evaluation of what would have happened if feed-in tariffs would have been designed in a way that would have taken into account regional differences in solar productivity. Moreover, if a new transmission line is built between the north and the south regions, this would have yielded gains that range from 14 to 22%, depending on the rate of solar penetration, our parameter gamma. So we conducted a benefit cost analysis and shows that additional transmission can be greater than 1 if we use underground lines and there is sufficient RES capacity reallocated across regions. Thank you very much. We'll be happy to answer some questions. So I see one of the questions is, do you believe a premium price type, David Brown says, do you believe a premium price type of policy combined with zonal, locational, marginal prices will have alleviated some of the issues with a fixed price fit? I believe so. That would have corrected, that would have helped to correct for lack of transmission lines. So I will be happy to discuss more about this. Paul Sarkis says, what type of competition exists in solar production in this market? Are solar panels owned and operated by big firms? So there is a combination of both. For the middle part of the paper, we used only installations that are residential. So installations that are lower than 10 kilowatts in capacity, which means that we were thinking that feed-in tariffs will affect primarily residential installations. For this last part of the paper, when we do transmission lines, we consider all solar capacity, which at that point would be a combination of big firms and residential installations. Jorge Luis Marquez asks, I understand that solution to this misallocation is to include in the feed-in tariff prices. I understand the solution to this misallocation is to include in the feed-in tariff prices to provide locational signals. I think this is related to David Brown's question about zonal versus locational marginal prices. Locational marginal prices would have definitely alleviated some of the inefficiencies in this misallocation. Did you consider the alternative or the option of demand side response as opposed to network reinforcements? No, we did not that in this paper, but that's an interesting point to combine. We really wanted to focus on the economics question of scarcity and allocation of resources. And that's why we focused on purely just this movement of capacity across regions. But definitely other policies in place will have effects as well. So if there are no more questions, so I'm gonna conclude here. We have a draft of the paper on our websites, and Stefan and I will be happy to answer more questions by email if there are any other questions.
All right, IAEE wishes to thank Dr. Mario Simano for an outstanding webinar. This webinar will be available on IAEE's website for future download. If you are not a member of IAEE, we encourage you to join by visiting www.iaee.org. We thank you for attending, and I now officially close this webinar.